Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a viscose crepe, super soft, super cool against the skin and really good for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my front. I have two layers of that fabric underneath my pattern piece. I have a notch at my sleeve and then a couple of notches at either side of the bodice at the shoulder. These will help me out later on. And then the first thing I'm going to do is stay the neckline. So I'm just using the selvage edge here to help give a little bit of support but without adding too much structure. So I'm just lining that up with the centre front on the wrong side. And I'm going to stitch about 1 millimetre or so inside my seam allowance. So I'm using a tiny little stitch length here, backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim off that excess selvage edge and give it a bit of a press, which I've done off camera. So that's how that looks. And now for the shoulders. So to add the shaping across the top of the shoulder, I'm going to use this elastic. So I've wound some onto a bobbin. I used this technique a couple of weeks ago in a little top, and I liked it so much I decided I would use it again. So I'm just going to run some lines of this elastic, starting about 1 inch from the top, working my way down to those notches you see me snip earlier. So no backstitching here, just running that line from the armhole right across to the centre front, snipping my threads. So that's my first line done. So for the second, I'm just lining up the edge of my foot with that first line. My needle is all the way over to the left and stitching. Snipping my threads at the end. So that's how that looks. So I'm just going to repeat this process the whole way down until I get to the notches you see me snip earlier. So I'm just finishing my last line here. So I think I did 6 lines in all. And now just to finish off this detail, I just need to give it a little bit of steam. So the one on the right hand side has already been steamed. So for the left, I'm just going to hover my iron above the fabric and apply some steam. And you'll see that the fabric here just shrinks down a little. So at this stage, I'm going to set the front aside to work on the back. So my fabric underneath my pattern piece here is on the fold. I have a couple of notches at the bottom of my darts, popping the pin in at the point of the dart and then finishing my notches. So a couple at my sleeve and one at the top and bottom of the centre back. So now to mark my dart. So just holding on to that pin and exposing the fabric underneath, I'm going to pop a dot just where the pin pierces the fabric. And then line my ruler up with that point and the notch and draw in my line. And then to pin the dart, I'm just making sure that my pin pierces the fabric right on that line on top and comes out on the line underneath. The seam the whole way up and then a pin on the horizontal at the point of the dart. So that's that one done. Same thing for the other side and ready to stitch. So starting at the bottom of the dart legs, backstitching, and just trying to follow that pen line the whole way up, pulling my threads at the end, and I'll tie those off camera, give my dart a little bit of a press, so you can see I've went ahead and done that here. And while I was there, I've just stayed the back neck in exactly the same way as I did the front, so using the selvage edge of the fabric again. So now my back is all prepped, I'm ready to join it with the front at the shoulders. So just lining up my front over my back, right sides together, and pinning those shoulders, and ready to stitch. So stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start, taking it nice and easy here over all of those gathers, back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So off camera, I'll just finish off that edge and give it a little bit of a press, so you can see I've done that here. So now my shoulders are joined, I'm ready for my sleeves. So I have 2 layers of that fabric underneath both of these pattern pieces. A few notches right around the sleeve head. They will match up with the notches you see me snip earlier on my bodice front and back. So before I can add the sleeve to the bodice, I have a little bit of assembly to do. So I want to join these 2 pieces together. So just lining up the flounce with the bottom of the sleeve, right sides together, and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. And of course I do exactly the same on the other side. So I finished off that seam on the overlocker and pressed it towards the flounce. So now that that's done, I can add my sleeve to my bodice. So just placing my sleeve right sides together with my bodice, lining up those notches you see me snip earlier, and pinning. And off camera, I've just popped in a few more pins around the sleeve head, evenly distributing that ease, and ready to stitch. So again, stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start, trying to stick to that seam allowance the whole way around. I want to maintain that beautiful curve of the sleeve head, and back stitching at the end. So that just needs a little bit of a press and that edge finishing. And while I was at the overlocker, I've just finished off the edges of my sleeves and my side seams in preparation for pinning and ready to stitch. So stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start, and on the right hand side I'm going to stop stitching about 1.5 centimeters before the waist. I've actually done this on camera on the wrong side, but off camera I fixed it. So if you're doing this, make sure you do it on the right hand side. So I've pressed both side seams open, and now that that's done, I'm ready to finish off my sleeve hems. So for this dress, I've decided on double folded hems. So to do that, I'm just folding my fabric over just by about 0.5 centimeter or so and pressing, folding again by the same amount and pressing. And once it's all pressed, this is how it looks. And I'm just going to stitch right along that inner crease edge. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, trying to stick to that crease edge the whole way around, and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks, nice and neat. So off camera, I've just given that a nice press. So that's my bodice prepped as far as I can go at this stage. So I have my hems finished on my sleeves, I've got that stay stitching all around the neck, got my shoulders nicely gathered, and got the little opening there on the right hand side. So I'm going to set it aside to work on the skirt. So for my back skirt, I have 2 pattern pieces. My fabric underneath both is on the fold, and for notches I have one at the top of the flounce in the centre, one at the bottom of the skirt in the centre, and a couple just at the top of the skirt. All of these will help me make sure that everything's where it should be when I come to put these pieces together. So that's my back skirt all cut out, and I'm ready to join these two pieces together. So just laying my flounce over my skirt right sides together and pinning, and stitching here at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. So that's how that looks. And off camera I'll give that a bit of a press and finish off that edge. So you can see I've went ahead and done that here. So my back skirt is ready for its side seams, but before I can do that I need to tackle my front pieces. So my front skirt has an underwrap and an overwrap. This is my underwrap. I have a little notch in the centre of the skirt at the top, and just one layer of fabric under both pieces. So just like the back, I need to join these two pieces. So I'm laying the flounce over the skirt right sides together and pinning, and stitching here again at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. So that's how that looks. And same thing again here, I finished off that edge and given it a nice press. So now my underwrap is ready for its side seam. So as I mentioned, my front skirt has an underwrap and an overwrap. This is my overwrap. I have one layer of fabric underneath both pattern pieces again. And just like before, I need to join this flounce to the skirt. So just laying it with the skirt right sides together and pinning, and stitching again at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, backstitching at the start and the end. So that's that done. And as usual, I finished off that edge on the overlocker and given it a press. So now that I have my back skirt prepped and my two front pieces, I'm ready to join these all together at the side seams. So this is my back, and I'm first of all lining up my side seams of my underwrap and back right sides together, pinning, and ready to stitch. So stitching at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, backstitching at the start, making sure the seam at the top of the flounce is nicely lined up, and backstitching at the end. So that's that done. So I've tidied up that seam edge, given it a nice press, and now to do exactly the same thing with my overwrap. So laying it right sides together with my back at the side seam, pinning, and ready to stitch. Backstitching at the start, at my 1 centimetre the whole way down, making sure those flounce pieces are nicely lined up at that seam, and backstitching at the end. So I just need to tidy up this seam and give it a bit of a press. So I've went ahead and done that off camera, so you can see that here. So now that my front and back skirt are joined together at the side seams, I'm ready to tackle the hem. So I'm going to finish the hem here in exactly the same way as I did the hem of the sleeve. So I've just folded, pressed, folded again and pressed. And now I'm ready to stitch right along that inner crease edge. So I'm just taking this nice and gently, trying to stick to that inner crease the whole way around. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. So that's how that looks, nice and neat and tidy. So off camera I'll give that a good press, and this is how it looks. So that's my hems complete. So now I want to add a little bit of strength to the waist. So I'm using some cotton tape here and I'm just lining it up right the whole way around the waist. And stitching about 1 millimeter or so inside my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Backstitching at the start. So this will just help to give a little bit of strength to the waistline and make sure that it doesn't stretch out too much when I pull the ties and when I'm wearing this. And backstitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim off that excess cotton tape, which I've went ahead and done here. So that's my skirt fully prepped, and now I'm ready to add the bodice. So I'm going to do that first of all at the centre back. So just lining up those notches you seen me snip earlier and pinning. Then lining up my side seams. Pinning. And lastly my centre fronts. And ready to stitch the whole way across the waist from one side to the other. So I'm starting at the underwrap, backstitching, stitching the whole way across at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And once I get to the other side, I'm going to stop stitching about 1 centimeter away from the centre front. You'll see how that works in a second. So that's how that looks. So I just need to tidy up this seam and give it a bit of a press. So I've went ahead and done that off camera, so you can see that here. And now before I can go any further, I need to make myself some ties. I've cut myself about 1 inch wide strip of bias tape. I'm folding it in half along its length and stitching. And I'm stitching using a tiny little stitch length and quite a narrow seam allowance here, about 5 millimeters or so. Backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. And I'm giving myself a little bit of thread here to help me pull this tie through to the right side. So I've just tied that thread to the end of a darning needle and using that to help me out in the pulling through. And once it's all pulled through, that's how it looks. So I'm going to leave one edge raw and tidy up the other edge. So just pushing some fabric back through the tie again, and I'll hand stitch that off camera. The raw edge I'm attaching to each side of my wrap, right sides together at the waist and pinning. And ready to stitch. So stitching within my seam allowance, backstitching at the start and the end, and of course I do the same to the other tie. So that's both my ties now tacked in place, and now that that's done, I'm ready to finish off that raw edge at the side of my under wrap. So to do that, I'm going to use bias tape. So just lining that bias tape up with that raw edge and stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, backstitching at the start, and once I get up to the tie, I'm just going to trim off the bias tape and fold it back on itself, just to give me a nice clean edge. Stitch right over the top and backstitch again. So that's how that looks. So now I need to trim down that seam allowance. So I'm taking off here probably about 2/3 of that seam allowance and pressing the bias tape away from the skirt edge. And I'm making sure when I'm pressing here that that trim seam allowance underneath is butted up against the bias. And now to understitch. So I'm stitching a couple of millimeters or so away from that seam line you've just seen me sew, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. So that's how that looks. And now another press. So I'm just pressing right along that crease edge. And then I'm just going to fold the raw edge of the bias tape in underneath. Again, just to give me a really nice clean edge. And ready to stitch right along that crease line. And while I'm there, I'm just going to finish off the top edge of my skirt there. So backstitching at the start, trying to stick to that inner crease edge the whole way along, using that same longer stitch length, and backstitching at the end. So that's how that looks, nice and neat and tidy. And now for that top edge. So I'm just stitching directly through those overlock stitches, backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. So that's that seam all nicely finished. So now that those edges are all nice and clean and tidy, I can finish my entire neckline. And I'm going to do it in exactly the same way as I just did the skirt edge. So I'm lining the bias tape up with that little bit of seam allowance I left myself at the bottom of the neck, and stitching the whole way up the centre front, around the back neck, back down the centre front, the whole way down the overwrap to the hem. So that's my bias attached. I now need to treat it in exactly the same way as I did my skirt edge. So I've trimmed my seam allowance, I've pressed and understitched all off camera, and now just finishing off that last line of stitching to hold that bias tape down. Using that same longer stitch length as I used before, backstitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. And with that, this little dress is complete. Got my hem all finished. I've got those beautiful flounces at the bottom of the skirt. Got my ties at the waist. My neckline all beautifully finished with that bias tape. Those lovely gathers across the shoulder. My sleeves in, nicely finished off with that fluted hem. And this is how it looks on. So I could not be happier with how this has turned out. So for those of you that have seen the inspiration over on my Insta stories, this is a little bit different, but I think it suits my figure much better. So I love all of the details of this. I love the skirt, I love the length, I love the fluted hems, I love those little delicate ties at the waist, that gorgeous gathering across the shoulder. I'm really pleased I tried that out. The fit, the fabric is so lovely, light and airy against the skin. Just love this one.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!